Hello, everyone. My name is Joy Ladin. Whoop, does not want to do this for me. Sorry about that. Hi, my name is Joy Ladin. I am a poet and a teacher. And a few weeks ago, I had the tremendous pleasure of visiting the Indianapolis JCC and having a wonderful evening with some of the community members, talking not about poetry, but about reading Torah and how gender works in our lives. It was pretty fantastic. In fact, one of the best visits I've ever had to any community. And I was delighted to be invited to help keep folks company while we are all shut in during the pandemic. Today, I would like to talk about something completely different. I'd like to talk about um, a game that anyone who can read and write can play to produce poetry or poetic language. So you don't need to be talented, you don't need to like poetry, you don't need to understand poetry. If you understand the English language and you can read and write, you can do this. So I'm going to explain that process step by step, and then I'm going to read you some examples of poems of mine which grew out of that process. So first, I want to explain the theory of this. I don't know if you are like me. Whenever you visit a friend and they have on their refrigerator those magnetic words, you can get sets of magnetic words that stick to your refrigerator, and they're almost always arranged into really interesting statements of some kind. Sometimes they're arranged, they look like poetry, sometimes they're just sentences, but I myself find it irresistible. The minute I get in there, I want to start moving the magnets around and just making crazy forms of language. But one thing that I noticed right off the bat is that a lot of what was on the refrigerators of friends who were not poets or even literary at all, a lot of that language was quite a bit more interesting than the language that I was producing in my own literary poems. I thought, how can this be? How can it be that people just moving magnets around on a refrigerator are producing cooler stuff than I do when I'm sitting down trying to write great poetry? And with some reflection, I realized that it's because great poetic language, language by not, there are many kinds of great poetic language. I'm talking particularly about imaginative language, startling language, language that's used in ways that you don't expect. That's not a strength of mine as a poet, but it is a strength of people who are just learning to speak, very young children. When they, when they're, as if you've ever been around two or particularly a 3 or 4 year old, you'll notice that they quite frequently say remarkable things. And they say those things because they don't yet know all of the rules that govern language use. They don't know what words you're supposed to put together and what words you're not supposed to put together. They don't know what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And as a result, they're just practicing using language in all kinds of ways. It's very much the same thing happens when you are standing in front of somebody's refrigerator rearranging magnets. Because the words aren't yours, they're just words stuck on a refrigerator, you don't feel responsible for what happens when you put those words together. And that enables us to suspend a lot of the rules that we learned as we were growing up about how we should and shouldn't speak. And when those rules are suspended, that enables us to create really startling, interesting, amazing language. So you can do this obviously with refrigerator magnets, but unless you have spent a boatload of money and have a very large refrigerator that is completely devoted to magnetized bits of language, I'm going to recommend another way of going about it. I didn't have a large refrigerator. In fact, I had a tiny college student mini fridge, so the refrigerator magnet thing was not an option for me. But I realized that I could do something that was quite similar to it. It was producing the same effect, which is I could take another piece of writing, a non-poetic piece of writing. I've did this a lot with women's magazines. I also did it with chunks of the Torah. Particularly in bad translations, I found that the bad translations of the Torah into English was very much like refrigerator magnets to me. It didn't make a whole lot of sense on the page, and so I felt free to rearrange the words. So the first step of this is to take a text that is not the kind of thing you normally read or like to read. So if you're a doctor, I don't recommend that you pick a medical journal. Why? Because you'll get caught up in reading the words of the journal, and you don't want to do that. All you want to do is pick out interesting words and phrases. So if you're a doctor, see if you have an auto mechanics journal or a stamp collection journal or one of these free pamphlets that people put, junk mail that people send you that you're like, why did you think I was interested in something like this? So a kind of language about a kind of subject that you're not usually interested in. That's step one. Step two, you have two ways to go. One is you can take a scissors and actually start cutting up the publication and create your own paper version of the magnets that go on refrigerators. Obviously, you're going to need a large area to work with here, a table or a floor, and you're going to need to make sure that nobody is going to run through or step on it. So if you have pets running around, you want to make sure that they are not able to run through your collection of pieces of paper. So that's one way to do it. You go through the publication and you start clipping out words or phrases. It's completely your choice. You can even take whole sentences. I wouldn't go larger than that just strike you as interesting. And remember, because you're not interested in the subject. Like for me, a medical journal would be perfect. I wouldn't understand any of it, but I guarantee that I would find really cool, interesting kinds of words and phrases. So you want to make a bunch of those, a pile of those interesting words and phrases. When you have a bunch, and it's completely up to you when you have a bunch, because you can always continue, if you feel like you don't have enough, you can go back to the source magazine and keep cutting them out. Then you can start rearranging them the way you would words on a refrigerator. You can also do this without cutting things up. I'm not I failed arts and crafts when I was in preschool. It scarred me for life. So I don't do cutting up and pasting and things like that if I can avoid it. For me, what I do is I look at the source material and I just scan it for interesting words and phrases, and then I write them down on a separate piece of paper. So I create my own written list that's the equivalent of that pile of refrigerator magnets. When you've got a bunch of words and phrases that seem interesting to you, then you're ready for step two, which is you start arranging them and rearranging them. And again, the only criteria that you have here, you're not trying to make sense. You're welcome to try to make sense if you want to, but all you need to do is put things together in ways that seem interesting, startling, peculiar. I didn't think of that. If you need to add little bits of language to make sentences that make sense, you're welcome to do that. There's no way to fail or cheat at this assignment. As long as you're creating language that's interesting, you're good to go. When you've got, what I found is that when I have a bunch of phrases or lines, because I think of this as poetry, I don't think in terms of sentences necessarily, but separate lines. And a line can be a whole sentence, or it can be part of a sentence followed by another part of a sentence. When I have a few that seem interesting and they sort of feel like they go together, totally subjective, that means whatever I say it means, then I often sit back and I think, there's this weird voice that's talking in these phrases. What is that voice talking about? If I want to, do I want to continue with this voice? And if I do, then I look for things that go along with the kind of stuff that's already been said. Am I not interested in that? If I'm not interested, I trash it and I start again. And I continue as long as I'm interested. And um, then I often work on it, sometimes for a long period of time, because I do identify as a poet. Being a poet means you get beyond the initial thrill of just putting stuff together, and you keep working to make something that feels like a poem. And I applaud all the poets out there. This is hard work, that initial burst of satisfaction. But this exercise is more about the initial burst of satisfaction and the thrill of seeing language that you've created, but it's not your language. There's a voice that's speaking, but it's not your voice. That voice is saying things. They may not make sense, but they're not things you thought of saying. And so it is, for me, it's this miraculous feeling of meaning and a voice taking shape in front of me. It came through me, but it's not mine. It just, okay, I geek out on this stuff, but nonetheless, I do. I find it really thrilling. And this is something that small children can do. In fact, it comes naturally to them, but also English professors like me can do it, as long as you're willing to suspend your normal rules of making sense and have that fun of just rearranging language. Now, there's a more sophisticated version of this, not very much more sophisticated, but it's also really cool. If you have two different source texts, like let's say you have a journal of, well, in one of the classes I did on this in Texas, one of the magazines that people was using was for uh, Latin, and Hispanic business people. So that was one source text. And then other source texts they used were travel magazines, or somebody was using like, it was a medical journal of some kind or another. Um, as long as these two texts are really different from each other, you'll find when you do this that different magazines have very different kinds of language and different kinds of sentences and voices and tones that they use. In fact, it's called a house style. It's designed, but also different fields of interest have different kinds of language that they use. It's why when my car needs repair, I often don't understand what the mechanic is saying. I don't speak car. But as a poet, I love car words because they have this kind of magical carburetor. What is a carburetor? There are people who know, but for me, it's just this kind of magical rhythmic word that I can stick into sentences. So if you do this, you have two different sources. You cut each of them up with a pile of different words and phrases, and then you start putting them together. Instead of just drawing from one pile, you draw from both piles. And you can do this quite deliberately. You can say, okay, I'm going to take one from this pile, and now I need to find something in this pile to stick it to. And really crazy things start happening with the language that grows out of that. So I hope that this has given everybody sufficient explanation to go out and do this. And remember, these are not rules. These are suggestions for inspiration. So if you come up with a better way to do it, go for it. For example, let's say you've got a bunch of bored children. You could create language piñatas. You could fill something that they could break apart with different words and phrases and have them smash it and then scramble around gathering words and phrases and then make things out of those words and phrases. The only rule about this is that it should enable you to feel delighted and feel like you have the power to mess with language in any way that feels good to you. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to the second part of this presentation, and I want to read you a couple of examples of poems that I've written this way. And these are poems that where they started in exactly the way that I said. They started with me taking a source and copying down phrases and messing with them just for my own pleasure. But then I worked on them and worked on them and worked on them and to turn them into poems. So the first poem I want to read you is called Secrets. And I went through a period of time where I wrote zillions of poems where all the words in each poem came out of women's magazines. I would find a women's magazine and I would go through it and make a bunch of phrases and words and put them together. It was very exciting to me because the way that I grew up, I had tried to avoid language that was seen as feminine. And it turned out that I had put pretty much all kinds of language in that category. Language that was about feelings, language about relationships, language about colors and tastes and sensations. Really any kind of language that had to do with vitality, I put in this forbidden category. So to get over that taboo, I forced myself to write poems where I would only use words that I'd found in one or another of these magazines. So here's one of those poems. It's called Secrets. And those of you who've read women's magazines know that they write a lot in the second person, which is to say there's a lot of articles about you do this or you should do that, you should do the other thing. Here's how you can make sure you put on your makeup the right way. So they use the second person, they talk to you, and they also talk very authoritatively. They talk as though they know exactly what you should do, and they assume you don't. So for whatever reason, I found this very exciting, and this poem does that too. Secrets. You discover them every day, leaning toward you, trying not to laugh. Your face is huge with secrets you pretend to avoid on your way to your next class, next dinner, next amazingly mortifying sweater. Even your sweaters smell of secrets. Fire stuffed in a drawer, music charred by prayers you thought were yours, happiness burning in books hurled across the room, a hideous mix of emotions that leaves burst marks on your kids. You think you're passing as a normal person, being silly, talking on the phone, giving the gift of pain to the family that makes you feel elegant and broken, like a cherry on a sword. Your friends see you as completely lost, a menorah of need and love burning hysterically at the top of the stairs. You pretend to be a total person, a model of truth, an amazing parent, but you're falling into the cracks in the charred foundation you thought was happiness. The secrets you chose never to reveal spill across the landscape of the love you thought you would never give, laughing like dolphins stuffed in a drawer, inviting you to swim. And when I wrote this poem, when I was working on it, it's just filled with words I'd never used before, like dolphins. I don't think I'd ever used the word drawer or invitation. I'm not sure I said secrets. I might have said secrets, but sweater? No. Mortifying? Absolutely not. And my poems also did not feature a lot of cherries or a lot of swords. So I felt like using this method gave me a much, much richer vocabulary, but also a lot of different images and ways of expressing feelings that I would never have come to on my own. Some years later, I got involved with a woman that I am now married to, and she was did a kind of work that I had never thought of before. She's a rare books curator, and among other things, being a rare books curator means that you get catalogs of rare books from dealers who hope you will spend tens of thousands of dollars buying these things. And she had them in the bathroom. So I don't know about you, but I'm a person who reads in the bathroom. And I started reading these catalog descriptions. Each page would have a different book or manuscript, and then it would have a description. that followed it. And I was really struck by the language that was used in those descriptions, like the women's magazines. This was a kind of language that I would never have used in poems, and some of them were words, I knew the words, but I had never really encountered anybody using them in sentences. And because they're also describing the content of the books and stories and manuscripts, there was a lot of language relating to different subjects that were being written about. So I thought, I'm going to take one of these book catalogs and I'm going to write a series of poems that is all created using words that I found in this one catalog. And then as the project developed, I realized I'm going to write these all as letters, and they're letters to big ideas or abstractions, not letters to actual people. So this is an example of one of those. It's called Letter to God. You say, because I'm always about to die, I am truly alive. My shadow stretches over fallen branches. My skin smiles under fingers of light. Grass smiles along the path you say is mine. When you look at me, you see a child. When I look at you, I see a woman under a tree, a dog, a sign, libraries of books I neither read nor write. Life for you is as easy as death. You do both all the time. Try it, you say. Be dead. Now be alive. Now be everything you desire. Now let desire lie. So I wrote a bunch of those. I had a great time writing them. They also felt a little odd to me because the language in book catalogs is kind of abstract and stiff. It's not emotional. Some years later, I started on another project. I wanted to write poems that were, let me step back here. So it's not a coincidence that I was writing to God. I'm a very, having a relationship with God has always been a really important part of my life, and Judaism has given me a lot of language for thinking about that relationship. But in Judaism, I think in a lot of religions, as you may have noticed, we do a lot of talking to God. But as individuals in the present day, we don't usually hear God talking back very much. And I wanted to hear what God would say in my poetry, but it wasn't just sort of God in general. I wanted to hear what this particular aspect of God. In Jewish mysticism, there's a concept, the idea that God has a male aspect, and that male aspect is associated with familiar things. You know, God is transcendent in the heavens, God judges, God gives orders, God makes things happen, God punishes, sends people into exile. All of these things God does, and God does from a distance because God is so far beyond humanity. These mystics said, you know what, we think there's we should think of another aspect of God, a feminine aspect of God. And the feminine aspect of God, because this is like the gender binary, it's the way the gender binary works, is the opposite of the male aspect of God. So this aspect of God isn't transcendent, isn't far away from humanity or far above humanity. The feminine aspect of God, they called this aspect the Shekhinah, from the word meaning to dwell. The Shekhinah dwells with human beings. In fact, the Shekhinah is so close to us that she feels it. When we're rejoicing, she's rejoicing with us. When we're sobbing, she is weeping too. When we go into exile, she goes into exile with us. When we feel lost, she feels lost. She doesn't exercise power, right? Because that's been given to the male side of God. She doesn't judge or condemn. Again, that's put on the male side of God. And in the traditional conception, she doesn't get to talk either. the male side of aspect of God does all the talking. So I have never been that into the gender binary idea that there are absolute differences between maleness and femaleness. But I found the idea of the Shekhinah very compelling and interesting. And I wondered, what would happen if the Shekhinah did get to speak? What would the Shekhinah say? And I was particularly interested because the Shekhinah is supposed to be dwelling in me right now and in you right now. It's dwelling in each of us. So the Shekhinah knows us better than we know ourselves because she's there all the time watching, feeling what we feel, knowing what we know, but she's also divine. If she were going to start talking, what would she say? And I wanted to see if I could create poems that would enable the Shekhinah to talk so that I could hear her voice. And I started to do it, and the results, I had a good time with it. Honestly, I thought I was pretty well qualified to be God. I did God very well. But the problem is that when I went over those poems, it wasn't the voice of the divine speaking. It wasn't the Shekhinah speaking. It was just me saying the stuff that I think all the time. So I realized I was going to have to do something different. I needed language that wasn't mine, that I could allow the voice of the Shekhinah to emerge from. So I went back to this method. I thought the first kind of language I need is certified divine language that everybody agrees really is language that God uses. And in the second half of the book of Isaiah, from chapter 40 on, you have lots and lots of speeches by God, greatest poetry that's ever written. There are two Isaiahs, and the second Isaiah is a great poet. And the first Isaiah is not, let's just say that. I don't want to trash him. But I thought, okay, so I'm going to take language, I'm going to sample using this method. I'm going to copy down interesting words and phrases from individual speeches by God in Isaiah, and I know that those words are like certified as divine language. Okay, cool. But I knew that the Shekhinah wouldn't sound like God in Isaiah, right? She is the feminine aspect of God. So I'm going to need to mix that language with another kind of language. And I thought, I'm going back to my tried and true method of women's magazines, except now I'm not just going to take magazines at random, because what I want to do is take a passage from Isaiah and then find an article in a women's magazine, and I chose Cosmopolitan, that is talking about related themes. And so I'm going to put words from Isaiah together with words found from from an article in Cosmopolitan that relates to it, and I'm going to mix them together, and I'm going to see if any of the language that comes out sounds to me like the Shekhinah talking. There were a bunch of other rules that I put on that to discover that, but what I'd like to do now, instead of going through all that, I would just like to read you a couple of those poems. It's from a book in progress called Shekhinah Speaks. The first poem that I want to read you is called Awake. And the passage from Isaiah, God is speaking, and it starts out with God saying, "Awake, awake, clothe yourself with strength." And the article from Cosmopolitan that I used is called "What Really Happens When You're in a Coma." You dream I'm looking down on you like a light on a ceiling, as though you were a thing and I were a thing, an object separate from your body, something you can blame for how you've been abused, a scar that lives in you, on you, has trouble breathing, sometimes, very quietly, bursts into song. You dream you're awake, trying to awake, to the presence holding you together like sticky surgical tape. Parts of you hurt, and parts of you are dying, and all of you is sick of feeling like you're nothing. You wonder why I let that happen, and why I don't help you escape if I'm always there, looking down like a light on a ceiling, naked and shining, even in your dreams. You wonder, not because you're a badass, but because you feel rejected, embarrassed, broken in ways you can't shake. If you are what I meant to create, what else could you be? The dream in which you see the light that never looks away is the glory of my love. That's when you're awake. Another poem, it's a little political. I was given an assignment by a magazine called Tikkun. They were putting together an issue called Beyond Patriarchy. And I thought, Beyond Patriarchy? I don't know, that's really not my language. But let's see if the Shekhinah has something to say about that. After all, the Shekhinah is a product of the patriarchal imagination, but she is not sticking to the rules of that. So the passage from Isaiah includes, it's from chapter 41, and it includes this language. Fear not, I am the one who helps you. I will open rivers on the bare heights and fountains in the midst of the valleys. See what a great poet Isaiah is? And I like this article a lot. I'm a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, but it's not great poetry. The article is called 7 Empowering Life Lessons from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And here's what happened when I mixed those together. Here's what Shekhinah said. I know. You're afraid to admit I'm talking to you because deep down you fear you're less than nothing. So anyone who would talk to you must be nothing too. Am I right? Patriarchy raised you to be afraid, to believe the demons, the vampires, the misogynistic gods who tell you you're hollow inside, who warn you to hold your tongue when cruelty and brutality, degradation and evil stab you through the heart. Patriarchy likes you this way, self-loathing and numb, believing you're no one I'd ever choose, a worm in a tunnel, chaff in a gale, a nameless pool of blood who doesn't deserve my love. I know how hard it is to keep showing up when the people you're talking to insist you aren't who you are. You, for example, keep confusing me with dust, men, dead for thousands of years. Wondering how to tell us apart? I have power. They don't. I summon them to judgment, the fears that stalk you to the ends of the earth, the shame and disgrace that nail you in your place, everything that gets in the way of you responding when I call and say, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Blood relations, clan and nation may fail when you need them, hurt you in ways that they confuse with love you in ways that hurt. That's what our old friend patriarchy teaches blood to do. I say, I was there before patriarchy, and I am there beyond it, opening fountains in the midst of depression, trampling kings underfoot, calling you to me across generations by paths you haven't walked, by ways you cannot imagine. I'm the father who sees you, the mother who understands you, every version, young and old, real and imagined, future and past, the guitar-playing angel, the queer, fluid light, the thresher of mountains, the solitary pine. Here's the soul you thought you lost. Here are myrtles and olives, deserts and brooks, entire continents I created for you. Here I am, the one who declares you have nothing to fear and nothing to prove, who soldered you, nailed you, gilded and pearled. Are you ready to be strong? Time to remake the world. I think that probably felt like a lot. So if you feel overwhelmed with the Shekhinah speaking, No judgment here. But if you would like to hear one more poem, this is a funny poem, one of the earlier ones that came out in the series. It's called Comfort Animal, and the passage from Isaiah is that chapter 40 where this Isaiah starts becoming a great poet. It begins, "Comfort, comfort my people." And the Cosmo article is, here's everything, absolutely everything you need to know about getting an emotional support animal. A voice says your punishment is ended. You never listen to that voice. You really suck at being comforted. Another voice says, cry. That voice always gets your attention, keeps you thinking about withered flowers and withering grass and all the ways you're like them. Hard to argue with that. Death tramples you, an unhousebroken pet, trailing prints and broken stems, pooping anxiety, PTSD, depression. It's better to be animal than vegetable, but best of all is to be spirit, flying first or maybe business class, with your emotional support animal, your body, curled in your lap, soaring with you above the sense of loss you've mistaken for the closest to God you can get. You want to cry? Cry about that. Who do you think created the animals to which you turn for comfort? Dogs, miniature horses, monkeys, ferrets, hungers you know how to feed, fears you know how to quiet. I formed them, fur them. It's my warmth radiating from their bodies, my love that answers the love you lavish upon them. Your deserts and desolations are highways I travel, smoothing your broken places, arranging stars and constellations to light your wilderness. Sometimes I play the shepherd, sometimes I play the lamb, sometimes I appear as death, which makes it hard to remember that I'm the one who assembled your atoms, who crowned your dust with consciousness. I take you everywhere, which is why, wherever you go, I'm there, keeping you hydrated, stroking your hair, laughing when you chase your tail, gathering you to my invisible breasts, more tenderly than any mother. You're right, you never asked for this. I'm the reason your valleys are being lifted up, the source of your life laid bare. Mine is the voice that decrees, that begs your anguish to end. When you suffer, I suffer. Comfort me by being comforted. Thank you very much for spending this time together. I hope you and everyone you love stays safe and well through this pandemic and through everything, and that you have a joyous Passover, even though it's definitely going to be a stretch. I also want to say that I am hoping to have a weekly half-hour thing on Jewish Live, which is another Facebook live stream. There is not a regular time for that, but if you're interested, keep your eyes open. I imagine that I'll be, if that works out, I'll be talking about a bunch of things and reading poetry and having guests. And so I hope to virtually see you there. And I want to thank Lev and Kelsey and everybody at the Indianapolis JCC. You are just the best. Bye.